Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Moran. Welcome to CPC London's inaugural webinar, the Caspian at a Crossroads, What to Watch in 2026. CPC opened the London office in 2022. Since then, we've delivered 6 conferences and numerous roundtables, including in the House of Lords and the Caspian region. We're now launching a regular program of webinars on a wide range of topics. Today, we're looking at the year ahead, which has many opportunities for engagement and collaboration. In addition to those mentioned in the events agenda, there's the Astana Regional Summit in April, which will focus on the environment, and 2 Caspian COPs, the Global Climate Summit in Antalya and the Biodiversity COP in Yerevan. So the spotlight will be on the region yet again. James Sharp is our moderator today, introducing our speakers and chairing the Q&A section, drawing on the points made on the chat. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome both to the panelists and also to all participants. And just to mention initially that one reason we chose this start time at 2 p.m. London time was in an attempt to see if we could actually allow the inclusion of people in the United States and the East Coast of the United States, and also before people go to bed in Central Asia. So this is, as David said, our first webinar. So we're just sort of testing the waters in terms of what time works best. So as David said, many significant things happened regionally last year. The Azerbaijan and Armenia peace deal, the Central Asian 5 became the Central Asian 6 with the addition of Azerbaijan. There's been progress on the Middle Corridor and also a lot of interest in critical minerals in the region. So the question for the panel, of course, is what next? And I have to say, I do recognise that we are living in what you might call the age of uncertainty, or indeed the age of disruption. And we really have no idea what news we'll wake up to tomorrow. And it's, I suppose, in the words, or to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, we're in the era of unknown unknowns right now. But we do have 4 excellent and actually very brave panelists, and to tell us what will happen over the coming year. And we've asked them to speak each for about 5 minutes on, really how they see the outlook. And as well as some sort of overview, we've also asked them to bring a particular slant, a specific perspective to their predictions. As David mentioned, there's Q&A in the chat, so we'll try to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers and discussion. So I'm going to start with Samuel Daveri Vesterbaye, largely because his was the first name on the advertisement that went out. And Samuel's the managing director of the European Neighbourhood Council, based in Brussels, and oversees all the ENC research projects across the whole European neighbourhood and the and Central Asia. So unsurprisingly, he'll be giving a bit of an EU slant or European slant to his intervention. So Samuel, if I can ask you to sort of start us off.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks very much, James, for the introduction, and thank you very much to the Caspian Policy Center and David Moran and everyone else who's participating today. I will, as James mentioned, just try to give a little bit of a brief overlook of Central Asia and Caucasus, its importance and what the EU is doing there, and maybe a little bit on what to watch out for in 2026. So why is this Caspian region important, especially in this new geopolitical context post-war in Ukraine? First of all, traditional energy reserves along the Caspian are incredibly important. Some of the countries put together in the region, represent up to the fourth, fifth, sixth largest reserves in the world. In addition to that, there's a large part of Central Asia which is steppe and that has high energy returns on renewable energy, namely on solar. So the square meterage in terms of this area is very kind of cost effective for renewable energy. Another part, which let's say is is less steppy and which is more undulating, is very good for hydroelectricity. So that's why the renewables are very important in this region. And then thirdly, critical raw materials are very important, especially in Central Asia, because especially Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have already conducted significant impact assessments on which critical raw materials they have, and they appear to have quite a substantial amount of critical raw materials which are needed for a variety of different technologies, everything ranging from kind of solar and wind all the way over to defense and battery production for electric vehicles. Another reason why this region is very important is because of its geographical placement. So when we look at a map, whether you go north and south or whether you go east and west or west and east, this region is particularly important for connectivity. Connectivity in terms of really roads, train, of course, digital infrastructure as well. And once we start looking at a map with regards to where it's more difficult to go through because of sanctions or where it's more difficult to go through because of other regions, it can also be because of conflict, then Central Asia is really kind of ideally placed to be able to have some connectivity. And then finally, it's also very important because every inch matters in this new global world of competition. And Central Asia for a long time has been kind of a region which has been seen as less relevant. But now that every single part of the world is kind of relevant for superpowers and also for middle powers, Central Asia has become relevant again. And I think with regards to, we look at what was said at Davos by the Canadian Prime Minister, this kind of very important discussion on middle country powers. Well, Central Asia holds some middle countries, most notably Kazakhstan, and but not only Kazakhstan, but these kind of middle countries are placing themselves in a way that they want to gain relevance on the world stage. They want to connect with other middle powers in Europe and elsewhere in order to not be squashed by superpowers. In the case of Central Asia, these are often regarded as Russia or China, obviously. What's the EU doing? Well, the EU is kind of per definition a middle power because it's a combination of a lot of medium and small-sized countries. And since the war in Ukraine, the EU has invested quite heavily in the Central Asian region. They have started with connectivity and infrastructure. This is simply because if you don't develop the connectivity agenda, meaning if you don't invest in logistics and infrastructure, then it's impossible to have trade or mining and so forth. So there's been two investors forums to date. One just took place late last year, and both of these investors forums have together added an investment of approximately 20 billion, so quite a substantial amount. Before the investors forum, there was a report by the EBRD, which came out in the summer of 2023, which said that the region necessitates approximately an investment of around 16 billion. So what the EU has invested is already well beyond that. And it also says that with that type of investment, the TEU, which is container traffic, which would go through the Trans-Caspian transport corridor, also known as the Middle Corridor, which before the war in Ukraine was under 20,000 TEU, and which has now gone up to 100,000 TEU. Well, the EBRD impact assessment says that if it's possible to invest the amounts that I just mentioned, then that number by 2040 could go up to well above 800,000 TEU. So that's a little bit the projection and also a little bit what the EU has been investing in and what it's doing. And then with regards to trade, it's important to mention that the EU is signing trade agreements called EPCAs. It has signed 3 in the region at the moment. The first one that was signed was with Kazakhstan before the war in Ukraine, actually quite a few years before the war in Ukraine. And what this EPCA did with Kazakhstan, it essentially opened up trade and preferential treatment to the extent that back in 2015, Kazakhstan #1 trading partners was Russia and China. And today, because of that EU signed EPCA, the EU has become Kazakhstan's #1 trading partner. So they just signed another one with Uzbekistan. They also signed one with Kyrgyzstan. And if these countries take the same trajectory, which is quite plausible in terms of estimations of the future, then we will see Uzbekistan's leading trade partner becoming the EU in years to come. And I'm not talking about in 20, 30 years to come. I'm talking about 5 to 10 years. Then the EU's other priorities are water and digital. And a lot of things can be said about it, but I have limited time. So with regards to water, the EU has invested both in low interest loans through the EBRD, as well as in actual grants from the EU Commission in various dams and in efficient irrigation. So most important project is probably the Rogun Dam in Tajikistan. So Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are mountainous, whereas Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are more or less flat or flatter. And so these irrigation optimization and dam projects will then help generate electricity, plus maximizing the water consumption in the other countries for agricultural and industrial projects. With digital, what I can quickly mention is that the EU Commission has helped, especially Uzbekistan, with satellite digital connection, something which is very important for the transfer of data and everything that goes with that. Very briefly, what to watch out for in 2026. I will just go through them very quickly. I would say what to watch out for is, of course, the Armenia-Azerbaijan pre-peace agreement. The developments, by all accounts, have been extremely positive and very promising. But we should also be cautious that, of course, the fact that Donald Trump and the United States is involved in this pre-peace agreement means that they are dependent on the United States. So that is something to consider. Number two, the Armenian election. It looks like the current Armenian government will win, and they have a very pro-peace agenda. But there is risk of disruption with regards to elections and in the digital sphere. So that is something to watch out for. And then some other points, just to briefly mention, is radicalization in the region, Afghanistan, spillover from Afghanistan in the region, both due to water management from Afghanistan, but also due to radicalization from Afghanistan, is something which is important to bear in mind, and that is a risk. Another thing to watch out for in 2026 is the organization of Turkic states, and whether the organization of Turkic states will be able to work more closely with non-organization of Turkic states like Georgia and Armenia, but also with the EU. For example, free trade area for the region would be very welcome and something that is worth watching out for. Another thing to think about for 2026 is pollution and labor conditions in the region. Once investment comes into the region, especially in critical raw materials, if they are not accompanied by environmental, social, and governance standards, then there is a risk of instability, which would be bad for the governments in the region, for the people in the region, but also for the investors in the region. And then another thing to watch out for is also increased investment in Caspian gas. Even though the EU is focalizing a lot on renewables, gas is still denominated as a transition fossil source. So that is something which could also happen. And then I think these are some of the main components to watch out for in the year to come. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Samuel. It's a really great list to kick us off with, and hopefully it hasn't sort of decimated the contributions of other participants. But your point about Caspian gas, I think, leads us on nicely to the next speaker, Benjamin Godwin from Prism Strategic Intelligence, based in London, who has over 15 years commercial experience in the Eurasia region. And we've asked Ben, as well as doing the outlook, to kind of give it a bit of an energy economic slant as well. So, as I said, the Caspian gas, your Caspian gas point, Samuel's got a very good lead into Ben's contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, James, and thank you, Samuel. Just a couple of points, I think, really to get the discussion going that we're certainly talking about with our clients. I think one of the big things that is different about 2026 compared with 2025 has been the return of the United States to the Central Asian region. Trump is clearly personally very interested in Central Asia, has some kind of strong personal connection with some of the Central Asian leaders, particularly of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And we know that President Trump is quite sort of bound by his own personal sort of relationship with various leaders. And the Central Asian leaders have done very well to court the interest of the United States. I think the view within Central Asia is that under the Biden administration, there was a sort of rather serious departure of the United States and other Western nations from sort of the Central Asian region. And it's certainly they're welcoming at the moment the return of the United States. It seems that the key interest from the United States is obviously, Trump talks about it all the time, critical minerals, transit routes, and then energy. And this is where Samuel's point about Trans-Caspian gas comes in. The United States have specifically referenced the idea of reviving this project of Trans-Caspian gas. I think the question that I have at the moment is that the mood music is fantastic. There seems to be a lot of goodwill from both the United States and from Central Asia and Caucasus leaders. But will it really amount to anything? We know these critical mineral opportunities are long-term opportunities, and they are very difficult to get up and running. Certainly, those of us that have been following Central Asia for a long time will have heard lots about Trans-Caspian gas and Trans-Caspian oil. And so we have to be asking ourselves, what is really different this time? What has fundamentally changed? And I think there could be some change there that would suggest that we're more likely to get some more adventurous projects in these sort of things. But also there's the fact that under the radar, very effectively, particularly around critical minerals and increasingly in energy, we're seeing the growth, a very actually rapid growth in the last few years, particularly of Chinese players. And Chinese competition in the region is very, very fierce. It doesn't make the headlines, but if you look at the projects and who's taking ownership and who's moving into them and who's investing, so much of this is coming from China. And so I think the US is going to have to work very, very hard to take this rhetoric into something that's actually sort of tangible on the ground. So the second trend that I sort of have in mind is security. And this comes in all sorts of forms. And we know that the leaders of most Central Asian and Caucasus nations are extremely security conscious. Samuel referenced security during the upcoming Armenian election. That's going to be a key point. And other leaders will be looking at the potential, for example, for Russian interference in that election and thinking about their own internal politics. But largely, this region is going through sort of a demographic boom. We have a lot of young people joining the workforce, but we also have somewhat of an inflation crisis, and these economies are slowing as well. So, for example, the Kazakh economy grew at sort of around 6% last year, but it's set by 2027 to settle down at about 3%. And that is the same for Uzbekistan. Many think that the GDP numbers of Uzbekistan are somewhat overinflated already. So there's the internal security of, can these governments provide enough jobs? Can these governments get inflation under control and provide sort of a good sort of socioeconomic basis for their population? But then there's also international security. We have seen Russia rather recede from the region, particularly the Caucasus, in the last few years. That has meant that Central Asian leaders have had to start thinking about, how do we manage our own security? Russia is not necessarily the security guarantor that it might have been 15, 20 years ago. So thinking about those countries that border Afghanistan and Iran. But also, what would be the impact of a peace agreement on Ukraine on Russian behavior in Central Asia and the Caucasus? While Russia has receded, will Russia, having a little bit more bandwidth if the conflict in Ukraine comes to an end, will Russia try to reassert its interest in the region? And all of this work on C5 integration, now to be C6, on developing alternative transport routes, may come under particular challenge. Sort of talking about transit routes, obviously there's the key question of the security of supply of hydrocarbons out of Central Asia. We've obviously seen these drone strikes on infrastructure around the CPC pipeline. That is potentially going to have a very severe economic impact on Kazakhstan in particular, if it's a prolonged phenomenon. And it's going to force both governments and investors to think about alternative supply routes. Now, this is extremely politically difficult, very costly, and it's something that everyone has been sort of rather punting and hoping that perhaps, there will not be a need for alternative routes. But I think events over the last year have proven that, Central Asia does need alternatives. For Western interests, obviously there's the security of oil coming out of the CPC pipeline. And then there are these huge potential gas resources that could come across the Caspian Sea from Turkmenistan. But one totally underreported issue is the supply of uranium, particularly out of Kazakhstan, which supplies more than 40% of the world's supply. 2 points here. One, largely that uranium is transited through Russia, although a Caspian route has been developed. But two, the availability of this uranium going forward is a real challenge. One, you have huge Chinese demand, and of course China sits on the border with Kazakhstan. It's a very easy export destination. And two, you have a very limited amount of regeneration of uranium resources within Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which are the key suppliers. And so we're likely to see a peak in uranium production in Central Asia in the next couple of years, and it's not clear where that supply is going to come from in 5 to 10 years' time. I'll finish sort of with a bit more of a sort of practical investor-focused point of view, which is I've sort of dubbed here leveraging the opportunity. Trump may be busting open doors into Central Asia and the Caucasus for investors to come in. That is obviously a positive. But how can investors leverage the opportunity? I think the key trend that we're seeing across the region, certainly over the last 5 years, is that these countries are now focused on a state-led development model. All of them have national oil companies, national gas companies, national mining companies. And the message that we're getting very clearly is that if you are an investor looking to get involved in critical minerals in Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, oil and gas in Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, that is going to be done in concert with national companies. The era, sort of the liberal era of the 1990s and 2000s is over. These countries are looking to places like the Gulf and China that have this hybrid state-private model. The era of listings on the London Stock Exchange seems to be largely over. We're more likely to see state-owned enterprises listing debt for their own investment rather than seeking investors into them. And so the real challenge, I think, for both investors and for Central Asian nations is, having chosen this state-led development model, can they convert that into something that does create this new generation of wealth for these nations? A lot of the initial investments of the 90s and 2000s have reached their peak and are starting to go into decline. Azerbaijan needs to renew its oil generation. Kazakhstan needs to renew its mining resource base. That has to be done. A lot of exploration work is needed. But can these state-owned enterprises and private investors work in concert to develop this new generation of resources? I'm somewhat skeptical on some of the plans that have been set out, but I would be very happy to be, proved wrong on some of these enterprises. But with that, I'll hand back to James and to the group.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Ben. Again, another long list of thoughts. Really excellent presentation. mean, thank you very much. I think on China, certainly we in CPC will be hoping to do a webinar on China's relationship with the region in the coming months, because as you say, it's, we tend in this part of the world and in the US, we tend to sort of look at it from a Western perspective, but of course it's, China is closer to them than we are and has a lot more money already invested there and a lot more direct interest, I think. So it is something which I don't think we've explored enough, quite honestly, and we intend to rectify that. So moving now on to Bruce Pania, who is a CPC advisory board member, but also much more than that, with over 30 years experience in the Central Asia region, a prolific writer, and of course a long-term contributor to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, when it existed. But Bruce is going to give us, I think, build on some of Ben's remarks about security and the outlook for security in the region, particularly the Central Asian region, over the next year.
Yeah, thank you. First, thanks to the Caspian Policy Center for the opportunity to speak at this event. And thanks to Samuel and Ben for leading on some of the topics I was going to cover anyway. Maybe I can shorten my comments here. First, I'd have to say that I do not see any clear and present danger in terms of security or defense in 2026. But I will mention some trends that are going on that I think are going to improve the security and defense situation in Central Asia that actually started in recent years. I'd have to mention first the border agreements in the Fergana Valley between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan last year as being a major achievement. We saw two clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, one in April 2021, one in September 2022. There have been shootings. Border guards have shot people for 3 decades along those borders, mostly Uzbek border guards shooting at people. There was a time where Uzbekistan had landmines along the Kyrgyz and Tajik borders too. It's hard to talk about regional security cooperation and trust when you have these kind of things in the background. Even if you're dealing with Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan who aren't in the Fergana Valley, this has a ripple effect on cohesion in the region. So it's huge that problem has been, the border problem has been removed, it seems anyway, and resolved in the Fergana Valley. When people talk about regional security in Central Asia, for obvious reasons, the first thing you're going to think about is Afghanistan and what's happening with Afghanistan. I don't see the Taliban as really being any kind of threat to Central Asia at the moment. All the Central Asian governments have established some kind of dialogue and relationship with the Taliban, and that includes even Tajikistan. And I know we've had some incidents along the Tajik-Afghan border in recent months, but they're really confined to a very small area of that border, and it's difficult to say what's driving this. There seems to be the usual drug smuggling is part of it, but there's gold involved in this and other things too. But I don't see that as being a threat to stability in the region. And again, they all seem to have an understanding with the Taliban. So I don't think Afghanistan is going to have a huge impact. Now, there are non-state actors inside Afghanistan, terrorist groups. This is something that the Central Asian governments have to consider when they're talking about security and defense going forward in 2026. And they're not just there. We know that every year they detain, arrest, and imprison people in Central Asia on charges of being somehow involved with an extremist group or with a terrorist group. Now, in a lot of these cases, the charges against them stem from use of social networks or possession of banned religious literature or something like that. But some of these raids have turned up weapons and materials to make explosives too. And these people are already inside the countries in Central Asia. And again, we know for sure this is happening because the local media is in these countries and the governments themselves will occasionally, security organizations will occasionally do a list of everyone that they've arrested, the terrorist attacks that they prevented during the course of the last few months or a year or something. So it is something that they have to think about. Not that any of these groups are in a position where they could actually topple any of the governments in Central Asia, but past experience when there has been a terrorist incident or attack in Central Asia have shown that most of the Central Asian governments will cast a wide net after an incident like that. So something that might be isolated in one specific area of the region, the investigation and subsequent arrests that go with it are all over the country all of a sudden. And that creates social problems within these countries too. Move along here. Defense. The Central Asian countries, of course, have been improving their own militaries and security forces. Certainly, security forces have been a priority since they became independent, internal security forces, but they've been improving their militaries lately too. Their spending's gone way up. They've diversified the sources for procuring arms and military equipment. Turkey is now, a major supplier of weapons. So it's less Russia and certainly less of the old Russian Soviet hardware that was being funneled out to Central Asia or just given up as Russia upgraded its own military equipment. Instead of that, you're getting a lot of Chinese arms, missiles, and like I said, Turkey's playing a huge role. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan produce their own arms and military vehicles, and now are producing their own military drones too, a lot with Turkish help. I think everyone except for Tajikistan has bought Turkish military drones. They all have Bayraktar drones or Anka, and Tajikistan, of course, is working with Iran to produce their own military drones, and they just used one a couple months ago on drug smugglers. So the first example of them using one of their own domestically made Iranian-style drone to solidify security along their own border. Okay, I do want to talk about regional security. This is Caspian Policy Center. So we've already heard about the Trans-Caspian International Route or Middle Corridor. I'm going to switch back and forth between those two terms. This is really the driver of regional cooperation at the moment, right? There's a lot of money to be made, simply. And all the countries along the route are already experiencing this new prestige in international affairs. People see the potential of the Middle Corridor. And so the number of people, the heads of state, the top officials that are showing up in Central Asia on a regular basis is amazing for someone who's been watching the region for years. Every month and sometimes every week, it seems like somebody's coming to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan and to the other three countries too. And the Central Asian leaders are making a bunch of trips abroad too to participate in different events, or whether it's an official state visit or as the C5 and now probably C6. I've half jokingly referred to this as being like one of the concert shirts that you buy of them going on tour or something during the course of the year. I mean, it's Moscow, Beijing, Washington, Gulf states as part of the Gulf Coordination Council, Cooperation Council, excuse me. So it's a kind of attention that they've never received in their lives, and it all stems from this Middle Corridor. So it's good for them, and like I said, it's potentially going to make them a lot of money, but it's only going to work if they can guarantee that this route is going to be efficient and that it's going to be secure for shipping huge amounts of goods between Europe and Asia. So what are they doing to try to make sure to show everybody that's considering shipping goods between East and West or West and East along this route? In October 2024, we saw the first military exercises that involved Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. They were held in Kazakhstan near the Caspian coast. Part of it simulated neutralizing a small group of people, presumed to be some terrorist group or something, but also the securing key facilities so that you can make sure that all the infrastructure was still up and working, specifically ports in this one case, which I thought was interesting. They held another round of these military exercises in 2025 in Uzbekistan. At the start of this year, in early January, the Azerbaijani president Ilham Aliyev proposed holding military exercises for the Organization of Turkic States in Azerbaijan this year, and that's probably going to happen. And we've heard about the Organization of Turkic States. They involve all those countries I mentioned in the previous exercises, except for Tajikistan, which of course is not a Turkic state, but Persian. But they have the addition, of course, of Turkey being a part of these exercises too. So this is another example of where the group, the Turkic states in the Middle Corridor, which make up most of the Middle Corridor, are working together to show that they can keep their route secure. But there's a couple things that are interesting, at least for me in this. The fact that they are able to get together and do this sends the message that they're able to defend their own territory without having to call on Russia, China, or anybody else. This is just them showing that they can do this. It's also again, and to show that if you're interested in using this trade route, they're able to guard it. And so it's really important for them that they are holding these exercises. And I think, as I said, the OTS exercise will probably be the first of many to come. But I see that happening pretty soon in the course of this year. Again, I don't see any impending threat for countries in Central Asia, but there are some possible destabilizing factors. And I'm going to come back first to the militants.
Bruce, maybe can I jump in there? Maybe we can come back to that in the questions and answer session later. I think that's probably better move on to Daria speaking.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Before we move on, just for all participants, just to remember that there is a Q&A function in the sort of the bar at the bottom. So we've got a couple of 2 or 3 questions in there already. But if you do have a question, please sort of type it in there, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time at the end to address some of those. So I'm going to move on now to Daria Isachenko, who is a visiting researcher at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. And Daria, I think actually originally from Kyrgyzstan, so obviously has a very sort of great personal experience of the region as well as an academic experience. And Daria is going to give us a slight Turkey spin, I think, on the outlook for 2026. So over to you, Daria.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I will first talk about the Turkey's current security and foreign policy priorities, and then towards the end also touch upon some observations what to watch. And when it comes to Turkey, the bottom line is that Turkey is bound to rely on its partner and ally in the region, which is Azerbaijan. So we will be seeing actually an increasing role of Azerbaijan in the region. And there are basically 2 reasons why Turkey has to rely on Azerbaijan, and actually fortunate to have such kind of ally. And the first reason is that Turkey is currently distracted by the Middle East. There is Syria, Iraq, Iran, Gaza, also further Somalia. And the trouble is also that when it comes to Turkey, in Syria, in Gaza, in Somalia, there are also tensions with Israel. So it is a distraction for Turkey, but Turkey does see itself as a Caspian country, and it also sees itself as a multi-regional actor. And being a multi-regional actor actually requires also some multitasking, which is why when it comes to Eurasian vector in Turkish foreign policy, there is indeed a big role for Azerbaijan. And the second reason why Turkey is bound to rely on Azerbaijan is because, or why Azerbaijan is actually indispensable for Turkey, is that Turkey itself does not have the same access to the region as Azerbaijan does, especially when it comes to the Caspian region. And sometimes there is a reference to, like, there is this reference of Greater Caspian region, but I would like to perhaps highlight that when it comes to the Caspian region, we really need to recognize that there are just 5 core Caspian countries. And my suggestion is that, or my argument is that the geopolitical dynamics in the region will be defined by those core 5 Caspian countries, which are Azerbaijan, Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Iran. And I think there is also this recognition in Ankara of this geographical limit when it comes to its policy, even though the region is important and currently actually, I'd say the priority is energy for Turkey in the Caspian region, but at least I see that there are also this acknowledgement of the limits that Ankara has when it comes to its foreign policy. And this is how I read the statement by the energy minister of Turkey that he made during the meeting of OTS energy ministers in December in Istanbul last year, when he said the Caspian Sea should unite, not separate the Turkic world. So, which is why I think there is this realization of the limit, and which in turn leads to kind of a desire to have really a deeper cooperation in energy and connectivity with Turkic states for Turkey. But as I mentioned, there will be an increasing role of Azerbaijan when it comes to the Turkish foreign policy. And before I conclude, I think my contribution would not be complete if I would not mention the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. And here I would really like to share one observation of last year, which I think is going to be an important one next year. I think Azerbaijan and Armenia are still to agree on the modalities of the route, and they still refer differently to Zangezur and TRIPP. But what I've noticed, there is a striking similarity in terms of how they see actually the connection of this route. And the similarity is that it's not only about east-west connection, but also north-south. The Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan talked about it in December in Berlin last year, where he basically mentioned that for South Caucasus to position itself as a key route in this, as a kind of a key region in this transportation, he basically mentioned all countries of the 3+3 platform, which includes not only like Turkey, Russia, and Iran. And also, if you listen to the interviews of Azerbaijani President Aliyev last year in August, when he gave a TV interview to Al Arabiya, he also mentioned that the Zangezur, it's not only about east-west, but also north-south. So what is to watch, I think, is exactly how this connectivity sharing is going to realize in practice. And because I think there is this realization that you have to, for connectivity to work in the region, you need to engage the neighbors there. And I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Daria. Excellent. So we have a number of questions here. A lot of them focusing on connectivity, actually, both physical and also energy. And some on regional cooperation. But I just first wanted to ask Samuel a question on his intervention. He talked about the EU's priorities in the region. And he didn't really mention the word democracy and human rights at all, which, of course, the EU tends to like to look at itself as a sort of a values-based organization. But the question, I suppose, is the EU waking up to the new world? I mean, I recall, I think, Aliyev in a recent Euronews interview said that international relations, and I'm reading here, international relations are entering a new era. It's not the rule of law, but the rule of strength that is ruling the situation. Is that something that the EU is now realizing and accepting, Samuel, do you think? Or is it still hoping that it can influence the situation? And I mention that not just in the context of Central Asia, obviously, but also the EU has an unresolved problem with Georgia and what to do with Georgia, given its policy has been to impose sanctions on members of the Georgian Dream government, for example, and is sort of pondering whether or not to reimpose a visa regime. It kind of feels to me that for 2026, there's a big question there for the European Union and what stance it takes towards Georgia. So I'd be interested to know just how you think that's going to play out in the EU in the next year, and then I'll sort of, as I say, I'll move on to some of the Q&A.
It's a good question. I can't really speak for the EU. I don't see any concrete policy difference on democracy or democratization as of today. But that said, I think it's clear that if the EU has an investment in a country that includes like significant supply chains and its own companies, like if it has more than, if the EU has more than 10,000 companies in a country, for example, and if it has significant supply chains, and if they have their own offices there and all these kind of things, then they innately will be worried about rule of law. From a very practical point of view, because it's obvious, like if you don't have rule of law, then if you run into some kind of legalistic problem, or if you have a leader in the country who wants to take or monopolize part of your company in some kind of way, or shape or form, then you run into trouble. So I think the concept of democracy for near-lying countries remains very important for the EU. When we talk about, and in this case, I don't know, I mean, we can think about where Armenia and Georgia lay in that. But when we talk about a country like Azerbaijan, or if we talk about the Central Asian republics, I don't think that the same standard of democratization will be maintained by the EU in the future. Now, this is not an official policy position, and they may have a different version of this, but I would find that difficult to believe. That said, I specifically mentioned ESG standards when I was giving my brief presentation, because when it comes to, for example, mining or some other types of investment in the region, if there are not any kind of environmental and labor and some form of governance conditions, number one, it can pose a problem for the legal structure of companies in the EU. So we do have due diligence legislation, albeit not as rigid as it used to be, but still there are standards that have to be upheld. And legally, that would be a problem if they're not met. But also in tandem, there would also be a problem for the region. I don't know if anyone here has seen Oxus Society's protest mapping of the region. So the majority of those protests took place in the region primarily because of Chinese investments, where there are very low labor standards and very low ecological standards. I'm not equating that to democratization, but it does fall under the category of rights. And I think it's important to mention, if you want to have sustainable business in a region like that, then you can't have protests on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. You cannot have significant environmental damage, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is this kind of legalistic component from the EU side, and then from the Central Asian side, I think there is a real risk concern. We mustn't forget that some of the protests that took place, for example, in Kazakhstan in the previous years, came out of Shenzhen in the Mangistau region, which was basically due to labor conditions. So I think that's an important factor in let's call it standards of the future, civic rights, ecology, and social rights.
Yeah, which is, I think, exactly the point that one of the points that Ben mentioned as well, the risk of labor disturbances. So in terms of questions in the chat, I'm sort of just looking at these now, and there's several connectivity ones, which I'll kind of join them together. One was, how do participants see the decline of the Caspian Sea level in terms of how that might affect the middle corridor? Another one is, do the panelists think there might be a need for the western end of the middle corridor to focus on the Zangezur/TRIPP corridor rather than the route via Georgia and the Black Sea, given the uncertainties in the Black Sea and in Georgia, which I just referenced? And also the other question was whether or not, building on from that, whether or not there's more, whether the alternative energy, the oil export route through plugging into BTC pipelines is a viable option at the moment. I don't know who wants to kick off with that. Maybe Ben, given the economics and the energy bit at the end.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was Nurul and John that gave us great questions. Quickly on BTC, the BTC oil pipeline obviously goes from Azerbaijan through the Caucasus into Turkey, into the Mediterranean Sea. That is currently exporting some Kazakh crude that is shipped across the Caspian Sea. Now, certainly in terms of capacity, the BTC has a tremendous amount of capacity that can be filled by oil from Turkmenistan and from Kazakhstan. The real challenges that you have around BTC is that Azeri crude is what's called light, i.e. it's very high grade, whereas particularly the Kazakh crude is heavy, i.e. low grade. And so the Azerbaijanis obviously don't want to dilute too much their high grade Azeri light crude by filling a pipeline with Kazakh oil. The other issue is also physically getting the oil across the Caspian Sea, which is currently shipping. Now, there are renewed discussions within the government of Kazakhstan about a trans-Caspian oil pipeline. But people like in the chat, like John Roberts and Nurul will know that that is a very painful geopolitical question, given the presence of Russia or Iran as literal states on the Caspian Sea. Regarding the question about Zangezur or TRIPP, absolutely. But at the moment, these governments are struggling with a very near-term risk in the Black Sea. And so I think what you're more likely to see in the short term is a revival of the Baku-Supsa pipeline, which is another pipeline from Azerbaijan that goes to the Black Sea coast in Georgia. Now, I think the thinking of most governments and investors will be that given that the Supsa pipeline comes out in Georgia, in the South Black Sea, is not on Russian territory, then it won't share the same security risks as the CPC pipeline. And that is the immediate concern. In terms of TRIPP longer term, certainly in terms of supplying gas, there is already some potential for gas infrastructure through the TRIPP corridor, and that could certainly grow, particularly to supply the domestic market in Turkey, I think.
Did any of the other participants want to jump in on those questions? No? Okay.
Maybe there was a question on the sea levels in the Caspian.
Yes.
I mean, I had a discussion with a logistics company and a European service, like let's say a company that provides services on dredging. And what they said in this meeting was that it's of course an expensive investment, but it is possible to do it, and there's already been consultations about it.
Okay, thank you very much. So another question was, how do you see the tendency of increasing regional cooperation in Central Asia developing in 2026? Is further integration and institutionalization to be expected? I think several of the speakers sort of touched on that, but I don't know whether or not one of you wanted to add further. Maybe Daria?
Yes. Well, I think we should not conflate cooperation with integration and institutionalization. I think there will be increase in cooperation, but sometimes when we talk about Central Asia, there is an inevitable comparison because integration is kind of associated with EU-like integration that kind of shapes expectations. But I think there are also many formats of cooperation formats in Central Asia, and even though they are named the same, like the C5 formats, but if you look at the content with each every country, it has a different substance. So I think there will be increase in cooperation, but no, I don't see any integration because of the previous experience with big brothers.
Fair point. One question I had personally was, which I haven't really touched upon, but then Ben talked about the economic outlook and demographics and need to find jobs and what have you. But current American policy seems to be to drive down the price of oil as much as possible, particularly at the pump. I mean, obviously there are implications for American shale producers at the moment, but however, with the Venezuela solution, if you like, if it does turn out to be that, and let's see what happens with Iran, but if there's a risk that there could be a large supply of oil and also LNG coming onto the market in the coming year, and that will then potentially drive down the price of oil. Do participants see that this would have or could have sort of quite big implications for some of the countries in the region? Obviously, I'm thinking of Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and maybe Uzbekistan in particular as oil and gas exporters. Would this cause massive damage to their budgets? I don't know whether Bruce has any thoughts on that one. Or unless Ben, you have your microphone off. I'm not quite sure that's because you wanted to jump in on that, or
Happy for Bruce to address. I can add something after, but
Bruce, yeah.
No, the only thing I would say is just that obviously it's going to have an effect. What does a country like Kazakhstan do if the price of oil goes down significantly? I don't know. I mean, their budget is state revenues are dependent upon this oil. I suppose they could look more closely and maybe bump up exports to China and make up in volume what they're about to lose in price. But like I said, Ben's more qualified to answer this question than I am.
Yeah, I think two things. One, yes, absolutely. If we take a country like Kazakhstan, particularly, we're talking about 30 to 40% of the government budget is directly or indirectly sort of funded by oil revenues. But I think there's a wider problem, which is Azerbaijan, for example, oil production has been in decline for the last 15 years. And it's, quite commendably worked very, very hard to stem that decline in production, which obviously requires new investment. And how do you attract new investment into the region if oil prices are, $50, $60 a barrel? It's very, very challenging. And the same for Kazakhstan. We're going to reach peak production in the Tengiz field probably by the end of the decade, early next decade. Kazakhstan needs to renew its resource base, and a low oil price is going to make investors somewhat reluctant to take a punt on the region.
Thanks. Next question I've got here is really for, I think, one for Sam, probably. Samuel, but it also could have, other participants may have views. But will the US and EU finance improvement of border and customs procedures and joint border crossing points in particular? And here I'm going to align that with a question I had really for Samuel, which is, what is the EU's role in Azerbaijan and Armenia peace agreement? Because we heard about TRIPP. Obviously, we've seen the actual fact that the summit was hosted by Donald Trump by the US, and we've heard about how the US is re-engaging the region, which is a region, South Caucasus, which of course is part of the European neighbourhood. It's the EU's backyard, and yet the EU seems to have been completely outflanked, if you like, by the US here. And you talk about the Armenian elections coming up and the constitutional referendum, which will follow on from that. And Pashinyan has to win both of those. So the question is, what is the EU doing to support the successful resolution of the peace deal? And I think this question fits into that, the extent to which the EU can actually get involved in some of the practical side of it in terms of borders and customs procedures.
Yeah, so in practical terms, the EU has a monitoring mission in Armenia, and it has a renewed mandate, I think, for 3 or 4 years now. This has not been particularly popular with Azerbaijan, but the Armenian government has requested that they stay, and of course the EU is staying. With regards to the actual negotiations of TRIPP, the EU has had no involvement in this, to my knowledge. I'm pretty sure. The question around the EU's involvement in the region, apart from, of course, I think it's important to remember that the EU cannot and will never be a lead negotiator on fast-paced geopolitical connectivity issues. The EU is a machinery. It's a huge bureaucratic machinery with a gigantic budget, and which is capable of moving infrastructure projects and securing low-interest loans that can have real impact on the region. But it is not an actor that sits down at a table, calls many other stakeholders, and makes a deal at the last minute. That's just not the nature and the structure of the EU. So to think about the EU in those terms is not possible. Now, that said, there are member states inside the EU that are, of course, playing a role in the region. And there's 1 or 2 member states in the EU which, of course, have a stronger tie to Armenia, and that relationship will affect TRIPP, without a doubt.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think your reference to the EU monitoring mission, of course, it was a target of Azerbaijan as part of the peace deal, which is that they think the Armenians have agreed to remove the EU monitoring mission from the border come a signature of the peace deal. I suppose the question for Armenia is whether that can be redeployed in some other function, which personally I hope it would be, because I've always been a fan of actually some sort of more neutral EU role in the region. So I think that we have now reached 3 o'clock. I think we do have one or two other questions, which we can probably continue for a little bit. But I just wanted to ask, if I may, Samuel, again, you, I'm afraid. First question we got was, I agree that the Roghan Dam is the current focus of regional hydropower, but it hasn't been an easy project, which, well, indeed, been going almost as long as the Trans-Caspian pipeline. But does Cambarata offer an opportunity to do better? I'm not sure how focused you are on hydropower and in Kyrgyzstan, but
yeah, I could not tell you
okay.
Specific knowledge about whether one. I mean, some of the problems with regards to Roghan Dam. I mean, there's a lot of protests and some environmental protests also linked to it. I don't know if the question refers to that or if it refers to the pace of development. With all major infrastructure projects, there are issues. I think all forms of infrastructure projects, whether it's in Tajikistan or in Kyrgyzstan, will take time. And if the question is referring to the fact that there are some environmental groups that have protested, then I mean I can only refer back to the fact that ESG standards should be of highest level in order to make sure that doesn't happen. But I'm not sure exactly what the question is referring to with regards to that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you anyway. Okay, I think that just really to just mention that we haven't really mentioned Iran at all, and the extent to which what happens in Iran might have some impact on both the South Caucasus and the Central Asian region. But again, it's one of those unknown unknowns, as I mentioned at the beginning. The phrase that Donald Rumsfeld came up with all those years ago. But of course, it could be a big factor. It all blows up, all goes badly wrong in that country. But I'd just like to thank all participants for this webinar, both the panelists and also those people that dialed in and asked questions. As I say, we in CPC, Caspian Policy Centre, do intend to hold these webinars, maybe strict webinars or hybrid events on a regular basis. So I look forward to announcing the next seminar or the next webinar that we have fairly shortly. But again, thank you very much indeed for all of your participation, all of the presentations, all of the great thoughts you have and predictions that you have. I've written them all down. So when we hold this event again in January 2027, I'll be asking you how you either got it fantastically right or how you got it horribly wrong, one of the two. But thank you again, all panelists, and thanks to all of those people who dialed in and asked questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.